Greetings. Good. Well, a very warm welcome, first of all, from myself, Monica Bohm-Duchin. I do see quite a few familiar names in the audience, but also some less familiar ones. So those who know the Insiders Outsiders project will, I hope, forgive me for saying just a few brief words about it. It's a project that took the form initially of an in-person, pre-COVID, of course, in-person nationwide year-long arts festival, paying tribute in a detailed and really quite comprehensive and wide-ranging way to the extraordinary contribution made by refugees from Nazi-dominated Europe, or Nazi-occupied Europe, to British culture. And COVID struck, we ground to a halt there. But actually, could everybody make sure that they're muted? I see one lady who's not, because I'm getting some background noise. Just make sure that you're muted if you wouldn't mind. Thank you. And yes, it's had a rich afterlife in the form of an ongoing programme of online events, of which this is one. So without further ado, I will introduce our main, in fact, our only speaker. I will be chipping in at the end and moderating the Q&A. I hope there will be a lively discussion afterwards. I suspect that many of you will know Dr. Anna Nyburg from previous encounters and lectures that she's given. She's a much valued member of our small select team running the Insiders Outsiders Festival project. She's indeed a trustee of the Insiders Outsiders Arts Foundation that was set up to kind of back up the project in practical terms. Besides that, though, she is many things. She's an honorary lecturer at Imperial College London, where she taught languages for many years. Her linguistic skills always impress me, for one. She's a committee member of something called the Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies, part of the University of London, which many of you may know about. And I've mentioned her role as a trustee of Insiders Outsiders. She's published widely on the topic of refugees, particularly in certain fields, art publishing and trade and design and industry. And to prove that, she's the author of some wonderful, really kind of, sort of seminal publications. Let me just mention a few of them. One of them is called Émigrés, The Transformation of Art Publishing in Britain, published by Phaidon way back in 2014 now. Another, The Clothes on Our Backs, How Refugees from Nazism Revitalized the British Fashion Trade. And I could go on, but I think that will do for the moment, except to say also she's co-edited a number of volumes, including another one that's relevant to our broad topic, which is called Innocence and Experience, Childhood and the Refugees from Nazism to Britain, which was published, in fact, by Peter Lang just last year. And perhaps most importantly of all, there is a new book in the offing very soon, I'm told, 4th of September is the official publication date. It's a history of Thames and Hudson, which I'm going to certainly ask Anna to talk about later in the year. So over to Anna to talk about the Émigrés' hugely important role in the development, the history of Penguin Books.
Thank you very much, Monica. And Monica is kindly going to
I'm going to screen share.
Yes. For various technical reasons. I hope you'll excuse us, but we're going to do the next slide, please.
That's fine. Just let me know that. Is this now full screen? How does that look? Is that okay?
Not yet. Not yet.
Here
it is. Yes.
Good. Lovely. Okay, over to you.
Pale but interesting. Hopefully. Okay, so Penguin Books celebrate their 90th year this year. It was in 1935 that they first appeared, soon already instantly recognizable with their paperback cover and orange bands. Alan Lane, its founder, was at that time working at the Bodley Head publishing company, but he wanted to branch out and make a different sort of book. In those days, a bit of a generalization, but British publishing houses were largely family firms with their own specialities, customs and traditions. Now, although it's not known for sure, it seems that Penguins could have been inspired by not one, but two German precursors. One was Tauchnitz editions. We have a slide, Monica.
Next one.
Founded by Baron Tauchnitz in the 19th century. These were English language editions which were only allowed to be sold on continental Europe. Alan Lane remembered in his memoir his father reading to him from Kipling's Just So stories in a Tauchnitz edition. But by the 1930s, they were showing their age. Indeed, this image looks, you can see they look a bit scruffy. They were cheap, but squat and unattractive. Now, the next step was taken by a fascinating young German who was also Jewish, called Kurt Enoch. He wanted to set up a rival to Tauchnitz's Continental edition, so they were also to be English language, but with more shelf appeal. He founded Albatross Books. Next slide. He took on somebody called Max Christian Wegener, who had in fact been sacked by Tauchnitz, and he engaged, this is Wegener, engaged one of the best book designers of the day, the Italian-based Hans Mardersteig. The results were these slim, streamlined books, color-coded, according to whether they were fiction, non-fiction, and so on. And if you're interested, there's a great book on the whole history of Albatross Books called, if you can see, Strange Bird. It's fascinating reading. And also in 1942 to 1947, Kurt Enoch would run the American office of Penguin Books. So I'm sure you can see where this is going. Alan Lane took on these design ideas too. Penguins were to be cheap, like Tauchnitz, but look thoroughly modern, simple, and striking, like Albatross. Alan Lane hired top designers, typographers, and printers, and as Penguin grew from a chick to a fully fledged bird, he took on his own authors too. Mostly, though, the books were Penguin versions of existing books, the rights to which Alan Lane had purchased. Commissioning his own titles came a bit later. The story of the choice of a penguin is actually disputed, with more than one person taking the credit, but it seems most likely that it was Alan Lane's secretary, Joan Coles, who suggested it. In any case, once the decision had been made, Edward Young, who worked for Penguin, was sent off to London Zoo to sketch penguins for the very first version of the logo. Here, Monica, next slide, is one of the many later versions. This one is designed by a German refugee typographer and designer called Elisabeth Friedländer, who, as you will see, was one of the very many refugees who helped to create the look of Penguin Books. After a tricky start, the chain Woolworths took 63,000 copies of the first Penguin books, and they sold out like the proverbial hotcakes. Penguins were on their way. Bit of a backstory now. There had been long, strong links between English and German book artists and publishers. A story which started with William Morris in the 19th century and his reaction against industrialization and mass production. Germans flocked to his studios to see his medieval-style books and his insistence on beauty for everyday objects, including books. But then Germans found a way to embrace the machine age, designing new typefaces suitable for the new mechanical presses, and Englishmen went to learn from them. In Germany, Leipzig, a city in eastern Germany, had long been the centre not just of German book production, but of European publishing. Important people in Britain, like Sir Stanley Unwin of Allen and Unwin, later the chairman of the Publishers Association, learned his craft in Leipzig, as did many others. So it was that Alan Lane and others knew of the caliber of German book producers and designers when the German-speaking refugees began to arrive in Britain at the very time Penguins appeared. I'll just say a very brief word. Most of you will know about the refugees, but when Hitler came to power in 1933, we saw in this country the very first, a small trickle of refugees, including many academics. And essentially what happened, each time there was a piece of major Nazi legislation passed, so for example in 1935, the Nuremberg laws, we saw a larger wave of desperate refugees coming to this country, and initially others as well. The largest influx came in 1938 when we had the annexation of Austria into the German Reich, and later the Nazi occupation of the Sudetenland as well. So up until the Second World War, from 1933 to 1939, is when the refugees could and did come. Okay, so we're going to come to our first person who was not really a typical refugee at all. Next slide, please. Here we have the very elegant Jan Tschichold. He was born in Leipzig and trained as a calligrapher and designer at the world-famous Leipzig Academy of Graphic Arts and Book Production from 1919 to 1921. I think it's fair to say in Britain, we certainly had nothing like this famous school where you learned everything to do with book production, from typefaces to illustration and so on. It's a centre of excellence. He freelanced as a lettering artist and designer. The 1923 exhibition of the Bauhaus at Weimar introduced him to modernist design, and he quickly joined the movement, rejecting traditional fonts and symmetrical composition, instead embracing sans serif typefaces, geometric construction, and asymmetrical composition. Next slide, please. Here you see a typical example of his work. Yes, you can see the asymmetrical composition straight away. Now, there's an interesting story about typography in Germany, where so-called black letter or Gothic script, called Fraktur in German, next slide please, remained in use into the 20th century. Now, I know we've got Latin here, but it's the same typeface. And certainly when I aged 13 or 14, when I started to learn German, we had most of our school books were in this very difficult typeface. A simplified typeface was both welcome and necessary. During the Nazi regime, there was, for quite a few years, a battle between which two typefaces to use. Should they use the traditional ancient Germanic Fraktur? But the problem was that it was barely legible to those in Nazi-occupied countries. The new Roman type looked modern and strong and reminded one of ancient Rome, another strong Nazi role model. Would that be the one? In the end, they decided that the Fraktur was Jewish, as it had been used by Jews who dominated the printing industry in Germany's past. Tschichold's writings and work helped spread modernist graphic design throughout the world. You may know that it was not only Jewish Germans and Austrians and so on who were attacked by the Nazis. Those who rejected the National Socialist ideas of art and design were dismissed too. After Tschichold was arrested in Germany in 1933 for being a cultural Bolshevik, his work was considered degenerately modern. He fled to Switzerland and worked as a book designer. In 1935, he came to England, where Lund Humphreys, you may know them as the publishers of our Insiders Outsiders book, held an exhibition of his work. Alan Lane insisted he wanted the best for his popular books, including the sort of typography usually reserved for luxury volumes. And they brought Tschichold out of Switzerland for 2 years, from 1947 to 1949, to create the new look of Penguins. Tschichold was known for being infuriatingly exacting. He found British publishers, I'm afraid, appallingly slapdash, and he insisted on 10 proof copies before accepting texts. He was also brilliantly creative and actually flexible enough to incorporate British typefaces and design too. He redrew the penguin logo 8 times, apparently finding it too portly. He laid down the famous penguin grid that stipulated page and cover design for all Penguin books, something which contributed to the sort of corporate branding of Penguins. Next slide, please. There you can see his notes around one of the, not the covers, but the first page, laying down how the spacing should work and the size of the type and so on. Schihold returned to Switzerland in 1949, but not before finding a worthy successor. He chose Hans Schmoller. I'm very pleased to see in the audience we have lots of family members, from some of them in America, apparently, from the Schmoller family. So I'm sure they'll have things to say and perhaps put me right on what I say about this very important person at Penguin. Next slide, please. Now you can see Hans Schmoller second on the left here. On the far right is Alan Lane himself, next to his wife, Mrs. Lane. Born in Berlin in 1916 to Jewish parents, Schmoller was only allowed to start an apprenticeship as a compositor with a Jewish press. And he also studied typography part-time in Berlin. This is very much a German model which continues still today, theory and practice in your learning. From there, he came to London to work at the Monotype Technical School. But unable to find a job, another job, he set off to Basutoland, which is modern-day Botswana, where ironically he found work for a Christian missionary press. When war broke out in 1939, Schmoller was interned as an enemy alien, apparently the only one in that country. In internment, he was allowed to read what he liked and to send and receive letters. He read one book from the famous Curwen Press, run by Oliver Simon. Curwen Press were known for their beautifully printed books. Schmoller spotted a typo in the text and wrote to Oliver Simon about it. On the strength of this talent for accuracy, Simon offered Schmoller a job at Curwen on his return to Britain after the war. Schmoller's nickname became Half-Point Schmoller, as he could reputedly discern minute deviations in the size and style of font at 200 paces. Both Oliver Simon and Schihold felt that Schmoller was the man to take over the look of Penguin Books. Schmoller carried on designing books, becoming head of production in 1959 and a director at Penguin from 1960 to 1973. I noted one anecdote in the Alan Lane biography, which reminded me of Schmoller's experiences. Despite his later success at Penguin, he refused to work on a cover for a P.G. Wodehouse novel because of P.G. Wodehouse's Berlin broadcasts. Some in Britain saw the Wodehouse broadcasts as evidence that he was a Nazi collaborator. Files released by the National Archives in 1999 showed the Director of Public Prosecutions was considering whether Wodehouse should face a treason charge. Many, like Schmoller, never forgave him. Victor Gallant's Left Book Club books had been warning the British public about the dangers of fascism since 1933. Alan Lane decided that this was important, and he initiated Penguin Specials. Stefan Laurent, a Hungarian Jewish filmmaker based in Germany, had been arrested in 1933. In Britain, Laurent, together with Tom Hopkinson, founded the Picture Post magazine. Next slide, please. A left-leaning magazine, which also told the truth about what was happening in Nazi Germany. Now, Alan Lane stepped up to that cause too. The first Penguin special was published in 1937, with its distinguished orange and black covers. And it wasn't long before Jewish refugees from Nazism joined the group of Specials authors. Stefan Laurent had written I Was Hitler's Prisoner in Britain. Next slide, please. And this became one of Lane's Penguin specials. An extract from it was published in the Picture Post. 35 Penguin specials were published between 1937 and World War II, including some which were not as such anti-war. Here we have on the left, Modern German Art, which was a Pelican special, hence the blue cover, written actually by somebody called O. Bihalji Merin under the pseudonym of Peter Turner. And it was published to coincide with the exhibition at the New Burlington Galleries, organized by Herbert Reed, in response to the Nazis' exhibition of so-called degenerate art in Munich. And you may well have seen the Insiders Out talk quite recently on this very subject, now or shortly up on our Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel. One of the Penguin specials was called The Internment of Aliens, a very interesting book written by somebody called François Lafitte, who, despite his French name, was actually German. And the book was written and produced incredibly quickly. I think within 6 weeks, they handed in the manuscript and it was printed and distributed. Nowadays, that would be almost impossible. And I have just a very brief story about that. One of the people I interviewed for my research was called Elna Brown. She was in her 80s when I interviewed her, and she had been interned. Perhaps you know that there's an internment crisis in 1940 when Churchill, in a panic, said to collar the lot, as there was a fear that fifth columnists, i.e. Nazi sympathizers, were in Britain, and he needed to contain all these thousands of German and Austrian, now categorized as enemy aliens, now that war had broken out. So Elna Brown was one of the many, although not as many women as men were interned, and I interviewed her. And she remembered that in the women's internment camp, it had been possible to buy a copy of this book called The Internment of Aliens, which was actually very critical of this panic movement, which had caused so much misery to many of the enemy aliens. And she thought it was wonderful to be able to read a critical book, a book critical of the British government, so unlike her experience of Nazi Germany, that she decided on the strength of that she would stay in Britain after the war, this country where you were able to speak your mind. When war did break out in September 1939, there was a huge appetite for reading for all sorts of reasons. There was lots of sitting and waiting. People couldn't go out as much. But unfortunately, paper rationing curtailed production for many publishers. There was a bombing of paper stock once the Blitz started. And of course, many people working in the printing and publishing trades were called up to serve in the armed forces. But the paper allowance of 1939 was based on the previous few years' consumption, and Penguin, in their first 4 years, had done incredibly well. So they were given a very generous paper ration. They had the additional benefit of finding that the 6-penny paperbacks would fit perfectly into a battle dress pocket, now that most men were in uniform. Now we come to our next refugee at Penguin, Nicholas Pevsner. Next slide, please. Nicholas Pevsner is worthy of a whole chapter in his own right, an interesting character. Born in Leipzig to a Jewish family, both he and later his son Dieter were mainstays of Penguin. But he enters the story on the coattails of 2 other Jewish refugees, this time from Vienna. Walter Neurath, next slide please, born in 1903, and here you have no mere photograph, but a sketch of him by his friend Oskar Kokoschka. Neurath had lost his publishing job in 1938. He was dismissed because he was Jewish when Austria was annexed by Germany into the German Reich. On fleeing to Britain with his family in 1938, he soon found work with another Viennese refugee called Wolfgang Voges, who was a successful entrepreneur. Voges founded a company called Adprint, which, along with many other activities, offered book packaging. Book packaging is when a company thinks up an idea for a book, commissions an author and the illustrator if necessary, then arranges the design and the printing of the book, finally offering up this whole ready-made package to a publisher for distribution and sales. Neurath became Adprint's production manager. In 1949, he would go on to found Thames and Hudson, the successful art publishing company, along with his third wife, Eva. Adprint's most famous series was Britain in Pictures, and it was a wartime success. Behind the scenes at Adprint were very many refugee art historians and others working as picture researchers and designers. Now, Voges and Neurath wanted to offer a British version of the very successful German Inselverlags books. These were little hardback gems with decorative covers. Next slide, please. So each one has a different patterned cover. They came up with the idea for King Penguins. These would be more expensive than the paperback Penguin books, but collectible and beautiful. Alan Lane loved them. Next slide, please. This is one of the first two produced by Neurath and Wolfgang Voges. One was on a book of roses, and this second one was called British Birds on Lake, River and Stream. And you can see how they look very much like the Inselverlag ones. The problem was now, the books came out in 1939, but the problem was printing them in 1938, because Neurath and Voges had wanted them printed in Czechoslovakia, which was a centre for beautiful printing. But the Sudetenland had just been occupied by Nazi troops. Eventually, rather reluctantly, I think, British printers were given the job, and they produced these two first books. The reviews were terrible. Apparently the printing looked awful. John Betjeman said that they looked like, quote, a mess on the bathroom floor, unquote. And worst of all, the editor for the King Penguin series, Elizabeth Senior, formerly of the British Museum, had been killed by a bomb. Lane asked Pevsner to take over the King Penguins, and he did so, after insisting on having a printer as a co-editor. The next in the series, next slide please, was called Caricatures. Sorry, that's the inside of the birds, King Penguins, which looks to me fine, but apparently wasn't up to scratch. The next slide will show that's the next one in the series, Caricatures by none other than Ernst Gombrich, a Viennese Jewish art historian who had come to London with the Warburg Institute. And the series went from strength to strength, despite not actually making a profit for Alan Lane. Alan Lane's biographer noted that King Penguins were the most loved of all the birds in Alan Lane's aviary. Now we're going to go back to Nicholas Pevsner now, because he has several hats. As I said, he was born into a Jewish family in Leipzig, where he took his doctorate in art history at Leipzig University. He was briefly a keeper at the Dresden Art Gallery and a lecturer in art history at Göttingen University. Always interested in design as well as art, he first got a job in Britain with the furniture makers Gordon Russell. In 1936, he'd had a book published on pioneers of the modern movement, and he was soon contributing to the journal called the Architectural Review, whose name was shortened by regulars such as John Betjeman to the Archie Rev. He was interned as an enemy alien during the Panic of the Mass Internment in 1940, but released in 1941 thanks to the efforts of Kenneth Clark and Frank Pick, which I think rather shows you the respect in which he was held, those two rather prominent people. Around that time, he was taken on to edit the King. Around the time that he was taken on to edit the King Penguins, he was also commissioned to write a Pelican, i.e., a non-fiction book, on an outline of European architecture. Shortly before war had broken out, Penguin had published a series of guidebooks to Britain, but they were thought to be feeble compared to the blue guides or shell guides which were already on the market. Pevsner had tried in vain to interest publishers in a series based on a German model, and now Allen Lane offered him all that he desired. He was to cover the buildings of England. He decided to cover 2 counties a year for the Buildings of England series, and he was given a car by Penguin. He didn't drive, he had to have a driver, and a petrol allowance. The first county was to be Middlesex. The project was beset with problems initially. Dick Lane, Allen Lane's brother, who also worked at Penguin, was rather concerned when an inspector from Scotland Yard called to say that several country house owners had reported a suspicious-looking man with a German accent who turned up with a tape measure in hand, asking if he could measure their houses. The first 3 titles, Middlesex, Cornwall and Nottinghamshire, were published in 1951 in paperback. Hardbacks were brought out the following year. The jackets and the elegant text layout was by Hans Schmoller, and the woodblock roundels on the front cover were the work of Bertold Wolpe, another refugee, of whom more shortly. Next slide, please. There you can see the roundel, and you can see this handsome hardback. By chance, I knew somebody who worked for many years at Penguin and was later a publisher in his own right. He was called Nick Jacobs. He told me that he was once given the job of driving Nicholas Pevsner around, as presumably Pevsner's driver was not available. Nick told me that his own parents lived in the county that they were to document, in a building that was both historically and architecturally interesting. I think it was Jacobean. He offered to put Pevsner up at for the night at his parents' house, and they went in together. But Nick was puzzled and disappointed that Pevsner showed no interest whatsoever in his parents' house, the reason being that it wasn't on his list. Presumably, he'd never have completed his Herculean task if he'd become distracted and deviated from the list. Pevsner was unusual as a refugee in that in Leipzig he had been fairly pro-Nazi, never believing that his Jewishness would count against him. He allowed his children to go back to Germany the summer before war, 1939, with the result that his daughter was trapped there for the duration and suffered her whole life from the lack of education. Her life was saved, but she didn't go to school. She told me that this had been a setback to the rest of her life. His son Dieter, on the other hand, had a very good career at Penguin, staying for the rest of Allen Lane's life, becoming after graduation a non-fiction editor in charge of Penguin specials and Pelicans in several fields. So now we come to Bertold Wolpe, whom I mentioned briefly before. Next slide, please. He was one of the examples of the golden age of printing and book production between the wars that I alluded to in Offenbach in Germany, where he grew up. After studying metalwork, I think silversmithing, and then calligraphy, he ended up working with a master of type called Rudolf Koch. And he stayed with him for 5 prolific years. Neither of the 2 English books that I have on Wolpe mention much about how he came to Germany, how he came to Britain, But he didn't shy away professionally from his Jewish heritage, as you can see in a minute from some of the examples of his work. His first job in Britain was with the Monotype Corporation, run by master printer Stanley Morrison. Wolper is known for some successful typefaces, including Albertus, named after himself. It's the Latin version of Berthold, his name. Next slide, please. That's him. And I think the next slide too. Yes, we've got Albertus here. That's the whole font. He also designed one called Hyperion, and at one point designed the typeface that was used for the Times masthead. I mean, that's real establishment kudos. He had a long career at Faber, where he designed covers. And for Penguin, he designed covers and graphic devices, such as this next one. Next, please. For a book called The Jewish War. You can see the menorah here. So he was able to use his knowledge of his Jewish cultural heritage for his work. Now, we're on the subject of covers. Covers had been a moot point at Penguin. Many editors there wanted their books to shout out their message and their contents from the shelves of bookshops, as other paperbacks did, especially the American ones. But Alan Lane had a horror of what he called breastsellers, presumably referring to the more lurid images of semi-naked women adorning some of the paperbacks. After a brief experiment using Abram Games, the very well-known graphic designer who did a lot of the design for the Festival of Britain, who was Jewish, but he was not a refugee, Alan Lane returned to the typographical covers, no pictures. But coming into the 60s, everywhere, there were exciting graphics, color supplements, color TV, and so on. In 1961, Penguin took on as art editor a man called Germano Facchetti. Next slide, please. As you can hear from his name, he was not German. He was not a refugee from Nazism, but from fascism, an Italian, a Holocaust survivor. Because he'd been a member of the Italian resistance, he had been in Mauthausen concentration camps. Italians, you might know, whether they were Jewish or in the resistance, were shipped from Italy over to Germany and Poland to the concentration camps there. In Milan, he'd worked with an architect. Facchetti took on somebody called Romek Marber, who was a Polish Holocaust survivor rather than a refugee, in that he'd survived the war in a ghetto in southern Poland, and he came to Britain after the war in 1946, where he studied at St. Martin's School of Art and Design, which is now Central St. Martin's. Marbeck designed for the BBC, The Economist magazine, the London Planetarium, and many others. He was also head of the design department at Hornsey Art College and at the Royal College of Art. Marbeck was to design a new grid or layout for the crime series. Next slide, please. These are Facchetti's designs, sorry, these first ones. Next slide, please. Here's from Marbeck. And Marbeck created another grid similar to the one you saw from Tichold, and it set a pattern that would be used for Penguins, Penguin Specials, Pelicans, and the Penguin Modern Classics series. And it was adapted by Facchetti for the black-backed Penguin Classics and the New English Library. I think next slide, please. Yes, there's the grid, the new grid, the Marbeck grid. Inevitably, older authors and editors regretted the changes. Of course, there was no pleasing all of the people all of the time, but Alan Lane liked the books to look modern if possible. Well, what about art books? Perhaps you don't associate Penguin books with art. In Britain, as already mentioned, there had been two refugee companies, Phaidon and Thames and Hudson, both founded by Viennese refugees to Britain. Other refugee publishers, such as Paul Hamlin, who was born Paul Hamburger, or Tom Maschler, published art books on their lists as well. Following an Art for the People series edited by Kenneth Clark, formerly of the Ministry of Information, there appeared a short-lived series called Penguin Prints. These were edited by somebody called Bernhard Baer. Baer, a Jewish Berliner and refugee. Next slide, please. He's on the extreme left here. You can just see him crammed in the photograph with other Penguin editors. According to his daughter, Susan Rack, he had managed to get to Britain on the strength of an offer of work from Penguin, on the condition that he brought with him his new state-of-the-art German camera. His wife, incidentally, was a close friend of François Laffitte, the author of Internment of Aliens, the Penguin special I referred to. So Penguin were very keen to use his camera for this new print series. Later, Bernhard Baer was to re-establish the Berlin Ganymede Press here in Britain. Together with his second wife, Anne Baer, Ganymede made collar-type prints of the work of eminent British artists like Henry Moore and Graham Sutherland. In the Allen Lane biography, we read, quote, Bernhard Baer, the serious-minded German editor of Penguin Prints, was shocked to find an editorial meeting taking place in a rowing boat at Silverbeck's Allen Lane's house, lubricated with lashings of gin, unquote. I must say, alcohol does seem to have played rather a key role at Penguin, though I can assure you that the famous bibulous publishing lunches, at least in my experience, are a thing of the past. Then another series, Penguin Modern Painters, started up during the war and was successful until the likes of Thames and Hudson and Phaidon came along with their own much larger format, beautifully designed and printed books, which also happened to be eminently affordable. I mentioned before somebody called Elizabeth Friedlander, who slightly anglicised her name to drop the umlaut, making her Elizabeth Friedlander. She was briefly mentioned, if you remember, as a designer of Penguin logos. But this was not her only task. Born in 1903, she studied typography and calligraphy at the Berlin Art Academy under the famous Professor E.R. Weiss. Her early commissions came from the huge Berlin-based publishers Ullstein, and she embraced all kinds of graphic work. In 1933, she designed her own typeface, a very unusual achievement by a female typographer. It was called, in German, Elisabeth. She was advised not to use her surname, which would have been more common, as Friedlander was a quite common Jewish name. Next slide, please. Here you have this lovely Roman typeface. She designed this in 1933, that unfortunate year when Hitler came to power. And she fled to Italy. And there she went to work for the publishing giant Mondadori. I only found out very recently that it was possible for German Jews to flee to Italy rather than stay in Germany. You would think that would be out of the frying pan into the fire from Nazism to fascism. But the fact is that the Italians are much less bureaucratic and didn't have good ways of documenting people's ethnic backgrounds and so on, so that as Jews, it was much easier to work there, certainly than in Germany. Elizabeth came to Britain on a domestic visa in 1939. But during World War II, she came into her own and worked on black propaganda. So this was not direct propaganda. This was essentially working on faking documents. She came into her strength here with her great knowledge of typography and printing. Fake documents, these were things like food coupons, which would say in German, you know, take this and you will be allowed a loaf of bread, whatever. And these were dropped by airplane onto German troops who, of course, when they turned up with these vouchers, were told there was no such thing. The idea was to demoralize and confuse the enemy. After the war, she was much in demand by publishers and others, doing several designs for Penguin books. She contributed many roundels and other printing decorations, and she worked for some years for Adprint as well, which I've mentioned, working with Walter Neurath and with Wolfgang Forges. Elizabeth had in her native Berlin been a talented player of both the piano and the violin, music being a common theme in German Jewish households. Penguin music scores were landscape in format with patterned paper covers, many of them created by Elizabeth Friedlander. The scores were objects of great beauty in themselves. Next slide, please. And I can't help noticing, can't resist this, I've just looked up and seen that I have a scroll of Elizabeth Friedlander typefaces. Sorry, no, it's not the right one. I do have a whole series of her printed paper that she used for covers, but that's not the right one. Friedlander held very much to her Jewish heritage, eventually moving to the west coast of Ireland to be near two Orthodox Jewish patrons of hers, for whom she made many designs, including this one. Next slide, please. There's the Rosh Hashanah card that she created for her patrons. Now we come to the final section, illustrators, and find that refugee illustrators were almost too many to mention. Many of them, of course, illustrated children's books, as these were more likely to be picture books. Puffin Books had started life in 1940, coinciding with the evacuation of children from cities to the countryside to avoid the bombing. So one of the illustrators was Lotte Reiniger. You may know her. Next slide, please. Typical is this use here of her black underlining, giving the impression almost of stained glass. Also, I made a connection, rightly or wrongly, with the Polish artist you may also know, Jan Pienkowski, who was born in 1936, who also used a similar method. He was a survivor of the, it's not a Penguin illustrator here, he was a survivor of the Nazi attack. He was in an air raid shelter during a Nazi firebomb attack when a Polish insurgent, as he was only a child then, showed him paper cut techniques. He later used these in over 150 picture books, and he moved to Britain in 1944. And I think if we look at, next slide, please. So here you've got Jan Pienkowski, and in the next slide, we'll have Lotte Reiniger. This is an example of her lovely, lovely cutout silhouette animation work. So she used this technique, as did Jan, to put black figures on a coloured background. She used this for her illustrations too. Moving on then, you may know a book called Emil and the Detectives. This was illustrated by somebody called Walter Trier, and there was one Penguin edition of Brer Rabbit in 1945. It was also illustrated by him. Next slide, just to show an example. Not Emil and the Detectives, but one in the same, it was a successor to Emil and the Detectives, Emil and the Three Twins. He also, this is This is Trier. Just explain a little bit about him. Following the rise of Nazism, he fled Germany with his family, settling in England in 1936. And I'm going to read just one sentence from the Ben-Uri entry. Quote, in Britain, he was able to continue working, designing in the region of 150 title pages for the humorous monthly magazine Lilliput. The magazine, which was Stefan Laurent, we heard about him, it was his precursor to Picture Post, and it was famed for its juxtaposed photographs. Next slide. Here we have Lilliput. He was also an illustrator of anti-fascist pamphlets for the British Ministry of Information during the war. So Walter Trier contributed Penguin Books as an illustrator, among many others. Now, we're running out of time, so I'm going to conclude. So now I'm going to ask myself a very difficult question. Why was there a disproportionate number of German, Austrian, and other refugee book artists and others, authors, largely Jewish, who helped to make Penguin Books? I think there are various theories about this. One could be the concept of design itself. Design thought to be a European idea before it was one in Britain. So even in textiles, something I know a little bit about, designers were trained in Weimar, Germany, in special state-of-the-art art and design schools, a bit like the Leipzig Academy. So they had proper designers, where in Britain, you were just as likely to have the design sketched out by the foreman of a factory, according to instructions from management. And more than one textile firm here in Britain had a German or Austrian refugee as their very first designer. Another theory is that German graphic designers had an instant visual language, which was very successful here. Again, fantastic training in state-of-the-art colleges and schools back home. It didn't matter if their English wasn't perfect, their images spoke for themselves. This was especially important during the war, when posters had to explain at a glance what the public must or must not do. The refugee designers were good at this. Just one example, although not specifically Penguin. Next slide, please. We've got here an example of design by Otto Neurath, who invented this system to show you at a glance. This is to do with the density of cities, big cities. And you can see, can't you, which ones are sparsely populated and which densely. And this is the kind of systems that they were working on in Germany and Austria. And there were many other graphic designers who worked in the war with our Dig for Victory posters and so on. And as to the Penguin refugees, they also brought with them, as I've mentioned, a fine German tradition of book production, both exacting and creative. Somebody I haven't mentioned yet, the typographer Rory MacLean, who joined Penguin Books in 1946. He had special responsibility for the design of the Puffin range. He learned his trade in Germany. And he remarked in a memoir, he also wrote Chickel's biography, he remarked there that he noticed in Germany, printers washed their hands before they worked. He thought that was very telling, the great pride that they took in their work. Rory MacLean was one of those who'd been instrumental in bringing Chichol to Penguin, having visited him, Chichol, in person before the war. So, one of the best known British brands still today, Penguins, owe a debt of gratitude to the very many refugees from Nazism who helped create their books. Next slide, please. There. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. Let me stop screen sharing. There we are. What a fabulous lecture, as I fully anticipate, and also very entertaining and, downright amusing in at many moments. So thank you so very much indeed. Now, Anna, you wouldn't guess it from her wonderful talk, but she hasn't actually been very well. So I don't want to keep her talking for too long. But are you willing to take some questions? And
yes, that would be lovely, I'm sure.
Beyond the
yes,
hour.
Heckling
lovely.
As well.
Let's just see what's come in. Right, we indeed have, yes, the extended Schmoller family. Welcome, all of you from far afield, the wonders of Zoom. One Mistake. Basutoland
Yeah.
is actually Lesotho in South Africa, not Botswana, but that's
Oh, it's Lesotho. Yes.
Lesotho, yeah.
Okay. Yes. Apologies for
Fine.
that. That came from perhaps they know, quoted in the Alan Lane Penguin book back. It's a mistake. Mistakes get printed as well. I apologize for
I'm
that.
afraid so. Absolutely. A good question coming in from John Hillary, and please, anybody else who'd like to ask something, do either raise your virtual hand or type in. Even if you just like to say something, just type something in so I
Yes,
can
please
see
do. Lots of
who the
experts
people
in
are
the
who'd like
audience,
to
I
ask. So
know.
yes, a good question from John Hillary. Did Alan Lane employ the Jewish refugees out of political solidarity too? And was he involved in any groups like the Artists Refugee Committee?
That's very interesting. In fact, one thing I see from my scribbled notes I failed to mention before I started to speculate about employing all of the refugees was that publishing is a business. And first and foremost, it was about employing good people.
Mm.
There may have been some sympathy. Of course, there must have been sympathy. Alan Lane was a very humane person, very left wing and very caring, but they would have had to have carried their weight and brought things to Penguin above and for. They wouldn't have been employed had they not been the very best. I don't know that he wasn't very. I don't think he was very clubbable. I don't think he. I don't know. It didn't mention in the biography that he belonged to any of those sort of organisations. But again, there may be others who know more who might be able to add to that.
Would any descendants of the appropriate people like to chip in at this point? You're very, very welcome. No, don't feel any pressure. Yona Yapu Kromholz from Jerusalem, whose mother was Edith Hoffman, the important editor of Burlington magazine. Just by the way, she points out quite rightly there was also the Pelican History of Art series. So really, you can go on, can't you? It's quite extraordinary indeed. I've got a question. While perhaps other people are thinking of things they might want to say. Given that, as you say, the disproportionately significant contribution of the former refugees. Was there any evidence that you've come across, or indeed anybody else in the audience, of resentment or professional jealousy at all, whether in Penguin or perhaps in the publishing world more generally?
Sorry, jealousy between who?
Well, jealousy of the refugees coming in, taking our jobs, doing things better, the usual sort of rubbish that one.
Oh, I see.
I'm just curious to know if there was any problem on that front.
My instinct would be to say no, that they were, these were heroes, people like Chichold. He was enormously prestigious. I don't think, given again that the sort of background, the training that we had, there wouldn't have been anybody of that caliber, I don't think. I don't know. I haven't read any, but again, there are lots and lots of books, interesting books published on publishing, books about books. I mean, the book I held up, the Strange Bird one, that is absolutely rife with backstabbing and terrible competing and so on. I was not specifically perhaps what you meant, but it is a most wonderful read, and there was
it is partly what I meant, because as some of you may know, for example, among the art restorers world, there was, I can't remember the exact title, don't quote me on this, but there was an active move to exclude foreign-born picture restorers from the professional society. They renamed themselves, I think, the British Society of Art Restorers, very pointedly, and I think in the music world also. So nobody, I think, is necessarily sort of above such things.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly as a very general statement, we must also remember that during the war, the refugees were there and not able to fight, even though they wanted to, but that the Brits had been called up, who were doing those jobs. So so it really was rather a win-win thing for publishing companies who employed them.
You've kind of hinted at their legacy and influence. How many of them actually were active teachers in the field? I mean, do we have evidence of their legacy in that respect?
I haven't got a list in my head. Facchetti and Marbeck, I think, both. Yes, I think people have done work, haven't they, on the refugees who've taught at art colleges. I think Ben Uri, for example, has compiled lists of all those.
I think they focus more on the fine artists, but yes, indeed, it would be interesting to know, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Mm.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, people are perhaps not so well known. Francis Carr as well. Despite his name, he was really Gesa Spitzer. He certainly taught at the London College of Printing. Of course, I can't think of examples now that I'm put on the spot,
Don't
but
worry,
there
I
were
wasn't
there were
planning.
very many,
No.
and it was a good way of making a bit of extra income as well.
Indeed. Nice comment from Suzanne Jean Perkins. Thank you. Very interesting. Jan Tschol was my inspiration. Also love the shouty specials covers and the 1960s covers.
Yes.
Nice, nice. Right. It's 7 o'clock. Anybody else would like to ask or say anything? Please feel free. No, much to think about. I mean, one could actually, out of this one lecture, one could actually do so many others, and we
Yes.
can indeed pick
Each of them are worthy of a
well,
talk in their own right.
absolutely. So, for
Yes.
example, Lotte
Yes.
Reininger is somebody who's fascinated me. I mean, as an animation artist as well as a designer, and I've long wanted to do a talk on her. So I think is it Fran Lloyd who? Anyway, there are people I plan to turn
Yes.
to. Another question just coming in
Question,
from
yes.
yes, from John Hillary. Did the Émigrés designers etc. continue with Penguin for long after the war?
Oh, well, they all had different stories. I mean, certainly Hans Schmoller, as I said, became a director without looking at my notes, I think into the 70s. Yes, depended how old they were, yeah, most of them had good long careers. I think Schmoller and Pevsner were certainly perhaps the longest serving, but yes, they did, yeah. And as we've just said, a lot of them had teaching careers as well, so they didn't just do that.
Perhaps just by way of rounding things up, I could just pick up on some leads you might like to follow after in the wake of this lecture. I mean, for example, I only discovered quite recently, and I don't know if you're aware, that Romek Maba actually wrote a Holocaust memoir, a sort of account of his own experiences in the Holocaust, which is actually available on the Romek Maba website. It's, I think, long out of print, and when I searched on Amazon, it was terribly expensive and rare. Easy, sort of not easy to find. But
I didn't know that. But
it is.
Facchetti also did a lot of work.
Yes.
I have a colleague, don't we, Chiara Barbieri, who did he made a film and all sorts of things about his Holocaust
Absolutely. No,
experiences.
indeed. I mean, they
Yes.
were, of course, in the minority, those who experienced the very worst that life can throw at you and came out the other end. But,
Yes.
they're very significant figures for obvious reasons. I also just wanted to mention Elizabeth Friedlander is somebody, again, I've been, sort of intrigued by for a long time. And I think it's available online. There's a very interesting filmmaker called Catherine Meynell from the Francis Meynell family who did a beautiful short film simply called Elizabeth a few years ago now, which I think you can probably find out more about on Catherine Meynell's website, and also actually on the Ben Uri website that Anna has already mentioned. For those of you who don't know it, Ben Uri is a gallery that was founded in 1915, but focusing to this day on mostly Jewish artists of immigrant origins, but also others besides. But there is actually a rather charming modern animated film about Elizabeth, which you can access if you go to the Ben Uri website and type in Elizabeth Friedlander's name. So I'd recommend both of those highly. There's also, incidentally, I mean, on the music front, as a kind of sequel to what Anna was saying about Friedlander ending up in Cork, apparently she donated her violin that she'd taken, her precious violin she brought over with her from, I assume, Italy rather than Germany, and it gave it to the Cork Music School, the academy there, and every year an outstanding student is actually allowed to use it, which is a wonderful example, isn't it, of a kind of living legacy, indeed. What else? One might just sort of point out that in internment, which was briefly mentioned by Anna, we have a whole sort of subsection in the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel on the sort of rich subject, really surprisingly rich subject of creativity in the British internment camps, which you might like to check out. She also mentioned a talk actually quite recently, which was recorded also, on Otto Bihalji Merin, alias Peter Turner, who wrote the modern German art Pelican Special, which is a really interesting publication. And also François Lafitte is an interesting figure, isn't he? And he was a good friend of the Elmhurst of Dartington Hall. And again, some of you might want to pursue that. We actually organised an online conference looking at Dartington as a place of sanctuary in the 1930s. It was a 2-day conference and really interesting. And that too, the recording of it is available on our YouTube channel. And this one too it's been recording, I hope, and we'll add it in the next week or so to that rather rich resource, though I say it myself. And yes, I should also add that sadly on the publishing theme, Marcus Lever, who was supposed to be talking about Paul Hamlin, who Anna mentioned very briefly, has had to withdraw for the moment. So his talk has been postponed, but it will happen later in the year. And if you subscribe to the newsletter, if you haven't yet already done so, you'll find out more. And to do that, if you simply go to the Insiders Outsiders Festival.org website and scroll down to the bottom right, it's the work of a minute. You simply sign up. I'm afraid we can't do it for you, but you'll get slightly sporadic, but always, I think, interesting newsletters. Good. So I think last chance, we've got nice thanks coming in from various people, and I hope you can see that. No more questions. Much to think about, much to enjoy. Good.
Too much.
Well, lovely. No, not too much at all. That was great. Lovely. So thank you very much. Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, all of you, for being here. And look forward to seeing you perhaps at some subsequent events. The next one, actually, next week on the 26th, rather different, is, it's the week after, 26th of March, is about the Émigrés educators, Kurt Hahn of Gordonstoun, Karl Koenig of Camp Hill, and Anna Essinger, who of Bodmann's Court. So actually, again, a rich subject. So perhaps some of you might like to join us for that. Lovely. Good night, everybody. And thank you, Anna. Thank you so very much indeed. All the best.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you.